My name is Julie Lang. I run a food blog called Twice as Tasty, and you'll find it at twiceastasty.com online. It's all about how to eat well all year round. If there's an overarching theme to the blog, it's about taking your food basics from scratch and the basic ingredients and creating things at home rather than buying pre-processed, commercially made, store-bought things as much as you can. So the recipes and techniques all on there focus on that. I also teach workshops, not usually quite this format. Most of the time, the workshops I do are hands-on ones. I come to your house, you get some friends together, and we make good food. And you'll find on the back table there, next to the donation jar for Free the Seeds, you'll find some flyers that talk about my workshops. There's a list of some of the ones that I'm currently teaching. There is also a sign-up list there for my email newsletter. The newsletter only comes about once a month. I promise I won't flood your inbox. It's a wrap-up of all the posts that went up on the blog that month, all the recipes, so you'll have a printable version. And if you want to sign up today on that list, I can send you notes from today's class as well. I don't have a handout, but you can get those via email if you'd like. So today, we're talking about dehydration. And because we've just got a short hour here and it's a huge topic, I'm just going to give you an overview of some of the things that you can dehydrate, some of the ways you can dry them, and things you may or may not have thought about as you start to dry foods. Drying foods has a whole lot of advantages, and particularly if you're drying them at home, particularly if you're growing your own foods. So for one thing, it's really easy. It's one of the easiest ways to preserve foods. Canning takes a lot more effort. Freezing, you got to have a lot of freezer space. Drying, you can kind of condense everything down, store it even in small spaces, and you get a really great benefit from taking your food down to that stage. It also intensifies all the flavors. If you've ever eaten anything dried versus fresh, you know it just packs this great flavor punch. I recently did a dried granola workshop and we dehydrated some huckleberries that one of the women had picked, which I wouldn't normally dehydrate because they're all so small already, but the flavor in those tiny little berries is incredible. Went great into the granola. So you really intensify all those flavors, and you also intensify all your nutrients. A lot of times, the way we have to process things to preserve them, especially with heat processing for canning and things, you got to bring it up to a temperature to get food safe, and you start to lose some nutrients. So dehydration, you can do at a lower temperature and save quite a bit of those. And the third thing that makes dehydration really great, as I mentioned, is the space-saving aspect of it. So there are some things that are key to think about when you're dehydrating in order to do it properly, and this is going to be a real short and dirty overview. There's a lot of nuances that can happen, but it's also something you can do really easily and just start trying to play with. The first thing is temperature. So the warmer it is, the more it'll dry up to a certain point. At a certain point, now you're cooking. So you're looking for that happy medium temperature. And a lot of times it depends on what you're drying. You'll dry leaves and herbs and seeds at a lower temperature. You're going to dry things like your prepared foods up at a higher temperature, or things that have a lot of liquid in them at a little higher temperature. But you're still doing a fairly low temperature, which kind of makes it a challenge to do sometimes in the oven, but there are some things you can dry in the oven for sure. The other thing is obviously moisture. You're dehydrating, you're sucking all of the moisture out of things, that's what's going to preserve it. So you're trying to get it to that nice, perfect point where it's dry enough that it's going to stay preserved safely and you're not going to get mold that develops and things like that. But you also still want it to be edible. If you've ever tried to dry your own foods and you went a little bit overboard and all of a sudden your fruit leather isn't rolling, now it's cracking and crumbling. You're trying to find that flexibility point right in the middle there, happy medium. And the rule of thumb kind of varies for different foods. Fruits you tend to dry a little bit softer. It's for two reasons. One, you're usually eating them straight out of hand without rehydrating them. And two, most fruits are high in acid, so you've already got some preservative qualities in there, so you don't need to get them quite as dry. Whereas vegetables, which are lower acid, if you're a canner, you know you can water bath can your fruits, but not your vegetables. You got to pressure can those because they're lower acid. Those you want a little bit drier, which usually doesn't matter because most of the time you're going to rehydrate them in some fashion anyway. So it all varies a little bit depending on what you're drying. We'll talk through some of these today, but you're mostly looking at sucking out as much moisture as you can to keep things from going bad. So the other aspect of that is when you do go to dry things and you think, okay, I've got it dry, I've got my moisture out, Now, how am I going to make sure it stays the way it's supposed to stay? And the main thing you're looking for is you don't want it to mold. If you see signs of mold, then something's gone wrong. You got to throw that batch out. So there's several ways that things you can do when you're storing it and getting ready to store it that make it all work better. And the first is cool it completely. If you're drying it in the oven or you're drying it in a dehydrator or anything that's adding heat, it's going to be more flexible and have feel like it has more moisture in it when it's warm. When it cools down, you might find out that it's fully dehydrated, or you might find out that all of a sudden this moisture that was on the inside sucks up to the surface and you need to let it go a little longer. So make sure things are completely cool before you go to store them. The next thing that's really important is to make sure that it is dried fully. So like I said, that moisture may come up and it might have looked totally dry when you pulled it out of the oven, and then you let it sit to room temperature, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm still feeling a little bit of softness in there that's suspicious. So you do want to make sure you get it fully dry before you store it. And sometimes that can just be a matter of leaving it out, stirring it up, letting it get a little air temperature and airflow in there. Sometimes you'll need to put it back into your heat source to make it work. And then the third thing is to store it properly. And when I'm storing foods, you're trying to limit your bacteria, your yeast, your molds, anything from developing. And what makes a lot of those happen sometimes is just being exposed to air. So I like to dehydrate my foods and store them in smaller packages in the size that I think I'm going to use it at. And if I've got, say, this is chamomile, if I've got a bunch of chamomile I'm storing for tea, I'll store them in little snack bags in the quantity I'll keep in my kitchen. And then I'll stuff all of those into a larger bag so I can keep track of them. But, you get that smaller package, then when I go to open up my big bag, the only thing I'm really opening up is the tiny bag inside it. That's the only thing that gets exposed to air. It's also helpful in case you do have something that didn't dry fully. If you've got one giant bag of something and something didn't dry in it, it's going to spoil your whole bag. But if you do package it in smaller portions, then you'll end up getting some drier results out of it. So besides the reasons I mentioned earlier about dehydration being easy and about how it intensifies your flavor and it's easy to store stuff and keep it safe, or save space in your house, a lot of the reasons to dry your own foods are because they really are better than commercial most of the time. A lot of the commercial dehydrated foods you'll dry, one, as you know, they're usually expensive. Two, a lot of times they've got a lot of additives in them. Sometimes they even have preservatives in them, even though the dehydration process is supposed to have preserved it. Sometimes for the commercial stuff they're adding more preservatives in. A lot of times they're using sulfur to, especially on their fruits and things, to keep their flavor, or to keep their color so that they look perfect in the package. And so you're adding a bunch of those kind of things into there. A lot of times they're also sneaking some sugar in on you. Even if you're drying fruits that are already sweet, you check the fine in print and you might find that they've added a little bit of sugar in there. Some that are really common to have that happen with are cranberries, because they aren't naturally all that sweet, but people now have this, oh, we want the craisin style super sweet cranberry. Sometimes you'll find them, they're sweetening them with fruit juice. Sometimes you'll find them and they've just got pure sugar refined sugar they're dumping in there. And the third thought for how they're drying some of these things is that sometimes they're not actually drying them even though they are in the dried food section. And one of the biggest culprits of that is banana chips. When you go to buy bananas, if you buy dried bananas that are actually dried, they should look kind of soft, kind of pliable. If you buy the rock hard ones that are sold as banana chips, most of the time those are actually deep fried in coconut oil. So you gotta be kind of conscious of what you're picking up when you go to buy dried foods. So these are all some good reasons for why you're in this room today. So that is kind of the down and dirty overview of some of the dehydration, and I know I went through a lot of that really fast. We're going to talk about some specific styles of dehydrating of different things and stuff, but are there any questions straight off the bat about just why am I drying my food in the first place? All good? All right, moving on. So, like I said, I run a food blog called Twice as Tasty. And part of the reason I started that food blog is that I've always been interested in playing with food and preserving food and eating good food. I like to eat and I like to eat well. So I'm a big fan of all that homemade stuff. And after years and years of doing it, and friends saying, "Oh, are you gonna, sell this or make this or do it?" I'm like, I'd rather just teach people how to do it. I don't want to go into full-scale production, but if I can teach you guys how to do it, perfect. So that's kind of where the blog evolved from. And so I run a great big garden. I'm teaching a workshop at the end of the sessions this afternoon on planning your garden from the kitchen, thinking about what you want to plant based on what you like to eat, so it's kind of working backwards. And I grow big gardens, and I try to preserve and save everything that I can out of it in one way or another. So I also live in a really tiny house, great big garden, real small house. It's about 500 square feet. So dehydration is a key thing for me because I can fit a lot more dry goods into my house than I can boxes of things. I'm also somebody who likes to play outdoors, so I like to be able to travel with food and take food on the road and out on my backcountry and outdoor adventures and things like that. So dehydration is often a key one for that because it's light, it's dry, it's easy to roll with. And you can, if you're out in the middle of the ocean and the sailboat's doing this and you want something hot in your belly, it's a lot nicer to have a stew that you can just put a little water on than to have to go down and whip it up and down in the galley. So I'm a big fan of the dehydrating stuff. And I dehydrate things in a lot of different ways. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about here today. Most people think, oh, if I'm going to dry foods, I need to have a dehydrator, I need to have all this equipment and stuff. But you honestly don't. You can, and I will recommend it, and I'll explain why as we go through this process. But there are a lot of things that you can dry without needing any special equipment at all. And one of the first ones, and since we're here for Free the Seeds today, are seeds. So if you go to one of the seed workshops later this afternoon, they're going to talk to you about drying seeds to replant in your garden. And drying seeds to use in your kitchen is actually a lot easier because I don't need these things to grow into another plant. All I need them to do is taste good. This is cilantro, which is one that I dry a lot of because if you grow cilantro around here, you know that the main thing it wants to do is produce seed. And it is fabulous in so many foods and dishes, and it's easy to dry. So cilantro is one of the first ones I'm going to talk about here. When you're collecting your cilantro seed, all you need to do is you let it go to seed, take a paper bag, stick it over the top of it, tie it off, cut off the plant stems, take that thing and hang it upside down somewhere where it's going to be dry. And just let it do its thing until the seed's totally dry. They're actually, you'll know they're dry when they fall off to the bottom of the bag. So once they're dried and you've got rattly jar of seeds, you're good to go. And this is not just, so I do a lot of Indian cooking and things like that, but you can also use this for your ground cilantro. Grind your own seed at home. One of the workshops I teach is an Indian spice workshop where we talk about using whole seeds and making our own spice blends, and cilantro is one of the ones that we put in the mix. And it's super easy to grind at home. You can do it in a coffee grinder is what I use. You can do it in a specific spice grinder. But it's one of those ones that your garden most likely really wants you to save cilantro seed. So you can also save, of course, the leaf. And that's kind of the next stage of our drying. And you can save a lot of the leaves in the same way. Cilantro, you can hang dry it. You won't want to stick it in the bag. You'll want to leave it out, but you can hang dry it in the same way that you would the seeds in the bags. You can also spread it out onto a tray. And this doesn't have to be a dehydrator tray, although those work if you have them. This can be just a tray that you're setting out somewhere where it's going to get, you don't want it in the bright sun, and you want to make sure that it's going to be in an area that stays dry. So, but you can just leave it outside and let it dry on the tray. Oregano is another one that I dry a lot of. It's a fabulous perennial to have in your garden. It'll just come back year after year. And you can just cut it off. It's actually easiest oregano because it's got that harder, woodier stem than a cilantro does. It's easiest to cut off the plant and dry it on the stem, and then you can just run your fingers up it once it's dry and collect it. And if you look in this jar, you'll see it's got some pretty big leaves in here still. And I prefer to store my herb leaves that I've dried at home as whole as possible and then crush them when I use them. You're going to get better flavor out of them if you leave them as whole as you can. So another advantage to drying your own versus buying in the store, a lot of times they've already been minced up quite fine for you, and you'll find that they lose their flavor a lot better, whereas this stuff stays pretty pungent for a lot longer. And again, you can do that on hang drying it. Just tie a string around your stems, hang it up, let it dry somewhere that's going to be out of sun but still going to get your dry space. Or you can spread it out onto a tray. I've got like some old window screens actually that I took out of my house that have a wooden frame that I use for some of my drying trays. I just spread a piece of cheesecloth on them because I don't want it in contact with that old metal. And I spread out my goodies on there. And chamomile is one of the ones that I dry on the tray because it's one of these, you gotta really love chamomile if you're gonna grow it and pick it because it's kind of labor intensive to pick all those little buds. But when you do, you just spread them out on that tray and it sits out and I move it around and shake it around a little while and then you end up with your tea making and you're all set to make your chamomile tea straight out of that. So you can dry with the herbs, not just the seeds, but also your leaf and your flower. And you've got your herbs for whole spices, you've got your kitchen herbs for using in all your dishes, and you've got tea making things as well. So chamomile, mint. The main herbs that I grow around here and I dry from seed are the coriander. I also do dill. Dill seed, it wants to set its heads and you can do the same thing. And if you grow fennel, you can get fennel seed out of it. Those are kind of the three big ones that I grow in this area. If you grow anything else though that you're like, I grow this plant and I use it in my kitchen, chances are you can be saving the seed from it to eat off of. And your herbs, we've got a lot more herb variety that you can eat the leaves of that'll grow in this area. I'm a huge fan of the perennials, oregano, mint. Those are all good herb options. Oregano, mint, sage, rosemary, those are ones that I'll hang dry. And then anything that's got a softer stem like the cilantro or the flowers like the chamomile. Basil is another one. Lovage, if you want to dry the dill leaf instead of just the dill seed, you can also dry the dill fronds. Those are all good ones to dry. You can do them on the tray. You can also do them in a dehydrator if you have one. And it's kind of where we start to progress into maybe we want to think about a dehydrator. If all you're going to dry is herbs, you can do it without any extra trays and you'll come up just fine. And these, you're just dry until they're crackly and crumbly, and so it's really kind of easy to tell when they're done and you've got them dry enough. So you can get away without a dehydrator, but if you do have one, you can set it on its lowest setting and then you can walk away from it and you don't have to worry if the wind blows or if the cat comes wandering by or something like that. So, yep. Got to keep some of those other considerations into play there for sure. But once you start through your herbs, then you start getting into some stuff that maybe you want to think about drying in a different way. And these are ones that I don't actually do from the garden. This is stuff that I buy, but I will eat a lot of and dry, and that's the stuff that I dry in my oven. And I primarily do granola. Granola is one of those ones where it's gotten hugely popular. It's also getting a really bad rap because they're like, oh, it's like eating cookies just in pieces. They put so much sugar in it. And a lot of times that's what's giving you your clusters in your granola is the amount of sugar they put in. So this is some of my, this is actually a baked granola. And this is actually a savory one that I made up to put onto soups and salads and things like that. It's got a little rosemary, a little sage in it, very little sugar. So you can see it's still pretty separate and it doesn't have a lot of clumps in it. When I do granola for breakfast, I'll use a little bit more sugar, but not nearly as much as the commercial stuff. And I'll get a little bit of clumping in it, but I'm mostly all about the flavor. Making granola at home is super easy. I just did a workshop on it, and these ladies came up with a huge range of fabulous granolas. We had like 30 different ingredients for them to choose from to make their own granolas. So you can play with all your flavors, and then you can start adding all your dried fruits and other things into it. You can have one batch of granola, and every day you eat it, it can taste different. So huge fan of doing the granola, and I like to do mine in the dehydrator. I think that it does condense the flavors and the textures a little bit better, and I can walk away from it, and it doesn't use all that much energy. The other way to dry granola is in the oven, and then you've got a couple of options. You can dry it on a super low temp, or even with just like a pilot light or the oven light on in your oven but it's gonna take some time. You're gonna have to stir it regularly to get it to dry evenly. And a lot of times, you really are not even turning on the oven very much to try to get that temperature if you just want it dried at the low temp. When I do granola in the oven, I tend to bake it because I don't like to run my oven for 8 hours. So I tend to do it at around 325, and it'll go for maybe 40 minutes. And I get more of a toasted granola than I do a dried granola. Still delicious, still very yummy. Sometimes a little harder to tell when I've finished it because it is warmer, so it's hard to tell when it's fully dehydrated or not. But that's one where, again, you can do it without any special tools, just do it in your home oven. But it's one, if you're going to do a lot of it, you might want to start thinking about whether you want to invest in a dehydrator. Another one that I do in the oven is pumpkin seeds. Those I do take from the plants that I grow. And whenever I've grown a pumpkin, I'll roast it up and I'll store the puree in the freezer. And I've got all those great seeds. I'll throw those in the oven as it's roasting, and I'll get these roasted pumpkin seeds. Again, I'm doing mine roasted more than dried, and I'm doing them at a higher temperature. But you can do them at a super low temp, but you've got to monitor them pretty closely and run things for a long time. So if you want to save raw pumpkin seeds that aren't toasted, you're better off probably in a dehydrator and getting your temperature than you are in the oven. But you can make it work. You just got to watch it and monitor it, and keep turning it and stirring it often to get it dried up. So, so that's kind of where we start to end the line of we can do things in the oven. The next few things I'm going to talk about, fruits, you can still do in the oven, but it starts to get a little trickier. At that point, looking into a dehydrator really might be your best bet because you're just going to get a lot more even results, and you're not going to run the risk of underdoing things or overcooking things. So I'm going to introduce you a little bit. This is my dehydrator here. This is an old dehydrator. I've probably had this thing for, oh gosh, maybe I've had it for 15 years. I've had it at least 10 years. And it's not a terribly expensive one, but I still have it and use it and love it because it's lasted me so long. Today, you'll find that they've changed the design up a little bit, but this company still makes a version that's like this. It's round with plastic trays in it. Mine has the heat unit on the very bottom here, and so it's running its fan and its heat unit out of the base. I believe the current models they're making, they've put the heat unit in the top. They found that gets more consistent and even heat flow through there. If you're going to buy a dehydrator, the things to look for are, one, you want a fan in it. Your air circulation is key. Two, get one that has a thermostat on it and a thermometer. Mine's got temperature ranges on it, and it's also got nice little notes that say, oh, use this range for fruits and veggies, use this range for nuts and seeds. Mine starts down at 95 and runs up to 155. So as you can see, we're still quite a bit cooler than you're going to be able to pull off in an oven. But it does have a bit of range there so you can dry things more appropriate temperatures. Most dehydrators do cycle, so you're not like going to get a nailed temperature. If you get a really high-end one, it might actually have a thermometer on it, a temperature monitor on it, like your oven does, that'll show you the specific degrees. But if you know, like your oven, chances are if you put a thermometer inside your oven, it's going to be different than the one that your oven actually says. So they're kind of the same with dehydrator. They tend to cycle the heat a little bit, which is sometimes part of the benefit of cycling. It'll help dry things a little bit better. So once you've got your base on it, then you end up with a bunch of different trays. Most of them, I think, come with about 4 trays. I've got some extra ones for mine. I know some people who've got, a huge giant stack of them. At some point, you start to lose some efficiency, but you can rotate and monitor, and if you're doing big batches, it may be what you need and want. These trays just have a mesh base on them, so they're great for drying things like dried apple slices and rings. I can just put them straight on the tray. I can put herbs if they're still on the stem, or basil leaves or anything larger straight on the tray. Granola, not so much. Gonna fall right through that thing. So a lot of times they will come with a mesh screen. So again, my granola might fall through there, but if I pulled my oregano off its vines, then I might be able to put that on there and get it to set in there. And then a lot of times they'll also come with a solid one. So this is what I'm going to put my granola onto, my fruit leather onto, and you can get additional ones for that. You can also make your own. I've got it's just food grade plastic, and I've had it for so long I can't recall if I ordered it online or maybe at the restaurant supply store down in Evergreen. I've just cut it to the shape of my trays, and easy to wash, use. I've had these things almost as long as the dryer. They last forever. If you don't cut into them when you cut your fruit leather, which I did do once. That one I'd throw out. And then you put your top on it, and away you go. You're good to dry. And so there's a lot of different models. There's square ones, there's round ones, there's different value prices, different sizes. Definitely look for one with a thermometer, one that's got a fan going in it, and one that gives you some ability to change the tray base in it, whether you're making your own or doing something else, so you can change up what you're drying in there. And that's where I like to dry things like apples. Do them in the dehydrator. You can do them in the oven, it gets a real challenge. But if you do them in the dehydrator, you're going to get a nice pliable apple ring. Great for snacking on, cutting up, doing whatever else. You'll notice mine are a little dark around the core, and they're not that perfect bright white you might find in the stores because I haven't treated them with anything. These are just apples. So if you cut up apples and you work fast and you throw them on your tray, this is about the color consistency you're going to get. This is all just browning from oxidation. It's not that there's anything wrong with the apple, but that's kind of what you're looking at. So if you do want to treat them at home, you can use ascorbic acid, which is your vitamin C. Dissolve a vitamin C tablet in water, and you can get a little better color out of it that way. You can do it with citric acid, which is your lemon juice and things like that. If you've ever made apple pies, a lot of times you'll sprinkle lemon juice on there to help keep things from going colored. But to my mind, I'd rather just have it straight up and not have any texture, and I don't mind the color difference.
Julie, are you peeling the apples before you dehydrate them?
Yep, apple's been peeled and it's been cored. So I cut out the middle core, I peel around it. You can dry it with the peels on, but it's going to be quite chewy and intense. The only time I really dry apple peels is if I'm going to actually I'll dry them to smoke. If I'm going to smoke something, I'll put them on instead of apple chips, and I'll dry up the peels to put on my barbecue for smoking. So yep. So yeah, this is just the apple flesh, and yeah, as you can see, these guys bend quite a bit. So they're dry to a consistency where I can just pop it in my mouth, but they're still dry all the way through. There's no moisture and texture up here. And you're welcome to come up later and check things out.
What temperature typical?
Let's see, apples. Let me look at my notes so I tell you right. Apples, I think I was running them for about 6 to 8 hours, and they're running around 140, 145. So. Yep, on my device here it says 135 as its fruit setting, so I'm kind of in that 130, 140 window. Yeah.
When you slice those, I found the first time I did it, I sliced them too thin.
Mm-hmm.
So
these guys I sliced probably twice this thickness. So maybe 3 times this thickness. I wasn't terribly particular about it. I just did it with a knife. I was just doing a small batch. I do have a mandolin that I use for canning, and so I'll set it at its widest setting probably for slicing. Yeah. But again, that might depend on your mandolin. So, yep. But yeah, they do condense down a little bit.
They sell.
Sorry?
About 1/8 of an inch?
For slicing, yeah, if you're slicing your fruit somewhere about 1/8 of an inch, it'll probably do you well, 1/8 to 1/4. And again, it might depend on just what it is you're slicing and how long it takes you to, how long you want it to take to dry it. The thicker it is, the longer it's going to take to dry.
They sell cores and peelers and slicers at 8 Ace. I picked one up there, and we did a lot of apples there.
Yeah, that's one of those ones
are really
that,
easy to
yep.
do. You just stick them on, turn them, and then
Turn them and away you go.
It's peeled,
Yep.
it's sliced, and it's cored, and it goes real fast.
It's one that I keep debating about whether I want to get, because I've got such a small house and kitchen, I'm kind of limit myself on the special tools I buy, but that's one that's on my list. So, yes?
There's one that comes on a KitchenAid.
Ah, there you go. So if you've got a KitchenAid, you can get your apple core adapter. You can buy apple core at Ace and you're good to go. Or you can do it the old-fashioned way like I did and just take your peeler and your knife and cut them up as fast as you can. Any more questions while we're on the fruit and the apples? Yeah?
What was the temperature you dehydrate granola on?
Granola, I tend to dry a little bit warmer. I think on mine, I'm doing it at one of its higher temperatures, so probably like 150, 145, 150. When I dry my granola, I'm just drying the grains, nuts, seeds, and whatever I'm putting in as a binder, liquids and things. I don't dehydrate fruit in my granola. I dry that separately. And a lot of times I even store it separately and just add it as I'm going to use it. If you try to dry fruit in your granola, your best bet is to grate it, because then it'll dry if you do want to like dry apple into your granola, you can grate it in there and then it'll kind of dry about evenly. But if you try to put apple chunks or berries or anything in there, they won't want to dry at the same temperature and speed. So, but I do tend to dry my fruit and granola separate and then store them separate, because sometimes your fruit can still leach a little bit of moisture in the jar and you don't want your granola to absorb all that. And you don't want to, again, you store things in small batches and separately you end up not spoiling your whole batch.
When you say you're drying grains, I've never had no concept of this. So you're actually, what are you buying at the store in order to dry?
So to dry granola, what I go and I buy are, so you'll find the recipes up on my blog, but my granola recipe, primary recipe up there is based on ratios. So I've got sweetener, I've got liquid, I put in a little bit of oil to help things stick together, grains, nuts, and seeds. And so all of those things will vary. Sweeteners, I try to use a sweetener that's already got some tackiness and stickiness to it. So instead of even a pure sugar cane or something, I prefer honey or molasses or maple syrup, because it's going to help with getting that nice clumpy texture a little bit more and hold things together. Liquids, a lot of times I'm just using hot water, but you can use juice, especially if you don't want a lot of sweetener in it. You can just use juice. It'll double as your sweetener in your liquid. I put in a little bit of oil there just to help things adhere and coat everything up. And then with the grains, I'm just buying the straight raw grains. So the granola workshop that I just taught, I'm trying to remember, I think we had rolled oats, wheat flakes, barley, rye, we had some rice flakes. We didn't have anybody gluten-free, so we didn't do anything specific there. But yeah, I tend to like a mix of grains, and I'll just buy those grains straight up. You can buy them, I prefer to buy them in bulk, and you can find them at almost all the health food stores around here. Will have quite a variety of them. For granola, I tend to buy at Natural Grocers. Their stuff is bulk, but it's pre-bagged. So I don't like to buy my spices there because you end up getting this giant bag. I prefer to buy those at places like Mountain Valley or 3rd Street or something like that. But I will buy my grains there that are pre-bagged. And then nuts and seeds in there and a whole range of options as well. Okay. So yeah, you're just buying that raw grain ready to go. Yeah. So we talked about apples, which is one of just the numerous fruit options you can dehydrate. I tend to try to preserve and dry things that I've been growing in my garden. It also has an orchard, so I've usually got apples coming out my ears. Pears, prunes, berries are an option. Again, like the huckleberries, they're going to tend to be really small and tiny, but you're going to get that great big flavor punch out of them. Cherries are a good one that I like to dry. I actually do tart cherries. I'm a high cherry fan, and I'll dry the tart cherries and throw those in my granola. So those are all some things that grow around here. And of course, if you're willing to take your huckleberries and not just stuff them in your face, you can you can dry those up as well. So a lot of those fruits, they will dry well, but some things like berries, like I said, you get the flavor punch, but they get real small. Some of those I tend to dry into fruit leather. I prefer to do it that way. I have a niece and a nephew every year for Christmas. They get fruit leather. Everybody gets food at Christmas, and they get the fruit leather collection. Fruit leathers, you can do in the oven. It's a little tricky to get it thin enough on your trays and to get your temperature to actually dry it and not bake it. So it's one of those ones where if you are thinking about doing a lot of fruit leather, now we are kind of thinking maybe we want to run with a dehydrator. And since my trays are round, I'll dry them on the plastic sheet. And I usually cut mine into thirds when they're dry, and then I roll them up. I've been experimenting. I'm not a huge fan of plastic, but it is kind of the best way, plastic wrap, to seal your fruit leathers for kids to take in their lunch boxes. I've just been experimenting with doing them with, and they don't show up as well in the classroom, but with just parchment paper. And then you got to store them in a bag, but I think they're going to work pretty well. Fruit leathers are great because then you can do flavor combinations too. For my niece and nephew, I come up with fun names for them. So they get Plum Yum and they get Razzle Dazzle fruit leather. And a lot of times if I'm doing a fruit or a berry, I'll try to do more of the liquid than of the fruit pulp because they have the little seeds if you're doing strawberries or raspberries and things. And then cutting them with another flavor keeps it from getting too seedy as well. So some of these up here, these are plum and applesauce is one of the great ones I like to dry. Sometimes I just dry the straight applesauce. I used to drive my mom nuts as a kid. I wanted applesauce fruit rolls, and she's like, I not only have to make the applesauce, then I have to dry it, then you'll eat it? Yes, Mom, that's what I want. So, but fruit leather can be a great way to go because you can play with those flavor bends, and then you've got them to take anywhere. You stuff them in your kids' lunch boxes, you stick them in your ski jacket pocket, you throw them in your bag when you're hiking, camping, in the car, just to have, the snack when you're on the go and not be tempted to pick up something off of the convenience shelf. So fruit leathers are always a good option. Again, trays are good. Yeah.
So the fruit leathers, you're making a fruit puree?
Puree, yep. So I'll take it and I'll put them in the blender and turn it into a puree. And depending on what I'm doing, will depend on whether or not it gets dealt with first. I tend to do...
Dealt with as in cooked?
Dealt with as in cooked, prepped, things like that. Applesauce is one of my favorites to mix in fruit leather, and I will make the applesauce and then add it a lot of times, mostly because I'm making big batches of applesauce anyway. You can certainly just cut up your apples and put them in your blender and do it that way, but chances are you won't want your peel in there. You'll want to take out your peel and of course your core. I've got some up here that are plum and apple, I'll put the plum skins in. And when you unroll the fruit leather, you'll see the little bits of plum skins, but they're soft. They don't get too hard like the apples do. So they just blend right into the fruit leather.
And are you like if you use parchment paper, are you dehydrating it on the parchment paper?
Yep, I've found that I like to do it, especially in the dehydrator, I like to do it on plastic. Obviously, if you're in the oven, you're gonna have to come up with a parchment paper or the slip mats. The silicone is what a lot of people are using these days, so they can reuse them. I found that parchment paper gets a little harder to peel it off of. And some people they're dehydrating their fruit leather and they're just rolling it up in that parchment paper they dried it on. Not as much a fan of that because I can't tell what that underside really got dry to. So I'd rather pull it entirely loose from its dried setting so I can feel whether it got dry all the way through in there. And so yeah, I tend to do it on the plastic sheets. I peel it off and then I wrap it in a different plastic. Yes?
How long do you find your fruit leather will last?
The recommendation from the powers that be in the food and government say room temperature, cool room temperature for about a month.
Okay.
Any longer than that, you tend to run the risk because you are looking at something that's a little soft and pliable. You can freeze them for up to a year. And when I make them and have them in my house, I'm often making enough to fill a tray. And we might go through, if we're in the summer season and we're using them out adventuring, we'll go through that in the month and I'll just keep them at room temperature. My niece and nephew, I'll often make them a giant bag and they'll keep theirs in the fridge. They actually like to eat them frozen. Go figure.
Going back to plums, I have that same dehydrator, and I found that it seems like they get too dry. They don't look like the plums that you buy in the grocery store at all. They like plum chips.
Yep.
How do you know when to stop and when they're safe to store on plums?
So it varies. There's a lot of variables that determine all that. So one's how thick you cut them, and so if you're doing halves, then they're going to take longer to dry than if you're actually cutting into slices, depending on the plums you have. Some of it depends on the juiciness of the plum. I have an Italian prune tree, and so those are a lot denser, so I find they take longer to dry than if I'm doing like a yellow plum or red plum or something like that. But they take longer to dry in the density if I leave them thick, but the other ones leak more moisture, so I'll often actually let them sit out and remove some of the moisture and drain off some moisture before I put them in the dehydrated. So one factor is going to be your thickness. Another factor is your temperature, and you can try doing it at a slightly lower temperature for a longer time. And you can try taking them off early, and again, let them cool, because you won't be able to tell. Even at the dehydrator temperature, they will be warm to the point where they'll feel different. And if you're over drying, chances are they feel perfect when you unplug the dehydrator, but when they cool, then they've gotten too dry. Another factor to keep in mind with that is that comparing commercial to home is that the commercial guys, most of them are supposed to be testing moisture content in their dehydrated goods. And a lot of times they're going to be moister than what you're going to come up with at home, because unless you're going to actually test your final humidity and moisture content, you're just doing it by feel. And so you err on the side of drier rather than the other way around. What I've found is that if I get things too dry, and especially if I'm using them in something, sometimes I can just rehydrate them a little bit of warm water. I'll make up my granola and I'll put my yogurt on it and I'll mix in my dried fruit and let it sit for 10 minutes while I make my coffee, and then I'll eat it and I'll soften it up a little bit. So, yes, question back here.
Your question, you were saying that sometimes you start the dehydration process and then you would let it get to room temperature and feel it, and maybe put it back in?
Yep, so yeah, if you're drying something in a dehydrator and you're like, okay, I've followed the recommended time period and it feels like it's dry, turn it off, let it cool to room temperature, and then feel and see if it really did dry to where you wanted it to. Some things are going to get drier as they cool. Some things you'll find, especially fruits, a lot of times you'll find they have moisture inside that's now come to the surface and they feel a little softer. If you're in a dehydrator, it's super easy. You just plug it back in again and fire it back up. If you're in the oven, it gets a little bit harder. By the time it's cooled down, now you're starting this whole cycle of do I rehydrate it again. But you can definitely bump it back up. You can always store things in the fridge and freezer if you're concerned that you didn't get them fully dry and you don't want to rehydrate them. But I usually go for trying to nail it, because storing it in the fridge or freezer sometimes, to my mind, defeats some of the purpose. Now I've used up that storage space. So, yes?
Do you store all of your dried goods in jars? I dry fruit and I store it in fabric bags, and I've never had issues.
Yep.
But I also dry it quite dry, so.
It depends on where you store it. A lot of times I'm storing mine in jars in plastic. I have an unheated mudroom that's a lot of my pantry in my house, because my house is so small, and it tends to be a little more humid in there than the main house. So I worry about leaving things too exposed to air out in there. If I were to store it in my main house, I'd probably do what you're doing, because I'm wood stove heated, and that air gets really dry. So yeah, it kind of depends on a balance. I tend to, granolas and things I'll store in jars. A lot of these things I'm storing actually in bags. I'll store in plastic bags because I don't have the space to put a huge collection of jars in there. That's reserved for the canning department, which is a whole other conversation.
Do you ever use a vacuum sealer?
I do not. I know friends who do and are a fan of them. I'm not, as much as I do use plastic, I'm not a fan of it. I tend to use zip closed freezer bags, and I buy the sturdiest, the ultra freezer strength ones. I've got a bag dryer. I wash them, I sanitize them, I reuse them. So I tend to do the zip closed bag option. But you can definitely do the vacuum seal. And I don't know, I think if you're dealing with things like fruits and stuff, then you're getting some good value out of that. I think if you're doing herbs and things, you're asking for a mess. Yep. So yeah, I think there you're looking to keep things loose and let them stay as whole as you possibly can. Yeah. So that's kind of where we are with fruits and things. Fruit options, definitely just doing the whole fruits themselves, dry them up, doing it in a leather, doing a puree. From there, you get into vegetables is your next step and option. And a lot of times if people think, oh, I'm going to dehydrate vegetables, you're a backpacker. You're carrying your gear into the backcountry, you want stuff as light as possible. And as you know, those meals are expensive that come dehydrated. So the more that you can do on your own to lighten your load and dry your food, happier you're going to be on your adventure for sure. When you go to dry, let me find my right page here, there we are. When you go to dry your vegetables, like I was saying earlier, fruits, you'll know if you can foods, fruits are higher in acids, so you can water bath can them. Vegetables tend to be lower in acids, so you need to pressure can them. It makes a difference in dehydrating to know a little bit about the acidity because you can have your fruits a little bit softer, a little more pliable, because they're already doing something naturally to be preservative with the acid in them. Your vegetables, they don't have that going for them. So you're going to be better off getting those a bit drier. These are dried tomatoes, which are on that cusp of fruit and veg, and for the longest time you can can them safely without any additives and things like that. We've gotten to the point where we've been changing our seeds in the tomatoes to where they're lower acid. So now you can't rely on them being always acid safe, which is why they recommend if you're canning and your water bath canning, you add a little lemon juice or vinegar or something into your canning. So when I go to dry them, these still bend a little bit, but not nearly as much as the apples do. These guys get quite a bit of flex in them, except for the one I just broke. Let's find a new one. There we go. Yeah, so these guys will bend quite a bit of flex. These guys, not so much. They're going to crumble before they do anything else. So this is kind of what I'm looking for with my texture. So when I do my fruit, I'm looking for leather, pliable, but you don't want it to, to hold a finger indentation in your fruit leather. You don't want it to feel like it's soft and squishy and still your raw fruit. When I'm doing my my vegetables, I want them pretty brittle. I want them to shatter, and that's going to be a drier option. These tomatoes, I did in the Dehydrator, and I did them up with a few herbs, a little bit of vinegar on them and things like that. So I can use them instead of, they aren't going to taste like sun-drieds, because sun-drieds does a different process and texture, but I'll use them instead of that. I'll rehydrate them and use them on pizzas. I'll throw them into soups and salads. They work great. You can crumble them up real small and put them onto any of your dishes. So I'll use these just as themselves, dried tomatoes on their own. If I was going to make a backpacking meal, this might be one of my ingredients in them. And depending on what meal you're making, maybe you want to dry all your things separately and put them together after the fact. Sometimes it's a good idea if you're doing a lot of different vegetables that'll dry at different times and temperatures. Most of the time it's a good idea if you do a lot of backpacking or are going to eat a lot of dehydrated meals, because then you've got your options to mix up your recipes. So you don't have to eat just the same meal all the time. You can do it with vegetables, you can do it with fruit in it, you can do it with meats in it. This is a dehydrated fish stew. It is all good and ready to go and be rehydrated in some hot water. It definitely crumbles. When you press on it, you want that thing to be pretty dry because you've got that meat product in there. But it's a great one. We take it out on an adventure when you need something hot and it's pouring down rain and you don't want to be out dealing with stuff. All you got to do is heat water and it rehydrates itself right up. When I'm drying something like this that's essentially a prepared item, like a soup or a stew or a sauce, I usually make it to my recipe, but I cut down on how much moisture I'm putting in it. So if I was going to make this for dinner, I might use 6 cups of shrimp stock in it. If I'm going to make it to dehydrate, I'll just use as much as I need to get everything to soften and adhere up and form the paste and puree soup style that it needs to do. Then I'll dehydrate it and I'll add that moisture when I go to rehydrate it again. Again, this is something that you're better off in your dehydrator. It's hard to get in your oven done for sure without cooking it. So, yes.
So you're pureeing it again?
This, I just made it like I would a shrimp stew.
So it has all the lumps in it?
It's got some lumps in it. It's got some clumps. I think I probably puree half of mine. I like it a little bit chowdhury, so I'll do half. But it's got potatoes and fish and vegetables and herbs and everything. it's good to go.
And then you pour it into your fruit leather trays?
Yep, I pour it onto these trays, and I dry it up. I stick the dehydrator somewhere where I'm not gonna smell it all night long. And I wash my trays and sanitize them very well afterwards.
How do you do with chicken?
Chicken, I cannot tell you because I actually don't eat chicken. I'm a pescatarian. I eat vegetables and seafood, but no other meat. So I'm not the expert on chicken or the expert on jerky. I do know that drying jerky is very popular and can be done. If you buy a dehydrator, they'll have instructions, recipes, all that stuff. A lot of times they'll send you a flavor packet. I highly recommend doing your own flavoring for it. Most of the times those are straight salt with a little bit of flavor. But yeah, I'm not going to be your expert for the meat department, unfortunately. Yeah. Yes?
And so how long would you dry your fish stew? I mean, how do you,
Let's see if I write down my time. Yeah, I think I've got my notes on there. I think, so yeah, I'm doing the fish stew. It took me about 6 hours, and I'm doing it on what my dehydrator is going to call its meat and fish setting, which is 155-ish.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
So yeah, so those are some of your backpack options. And then there are other things you can dry that you may not have ever thought about before. I am a sourdough bread maker, and I teach workshops. I've actually got one that I'm teaching right now on making sourdough pita breads. And when I teach my workshops, I show up with starter for everybody who takes the workshop. They get their own sourdough starter to take home. Good reason to take a workshop. But it also means I have to physically deliver you sourdough starter. So this year I worked on drying my starter, and I've been mailing it all over the world to people. And I did a dried starter giveaway all the month of January, and I sent it over to England, I sent it down to Texas, it's been up into Canada. Everybody who's woken it up has had great success. I just had someone tell me today that she got hers woken up. So yeah, the dehydrated sourdough starter is an option. I air dried mine, but you can do it in your dehydrator. Another thing that I dry that you may not think of is chilies, and we actually smoke these to dry. So I have a lovely ancient 4 times hand-me-down Weber charcoal grill, old school style, that takes briquettes. And we smoke chilies on it, so I can make the most delicious smoked chili paste you've ever tasted. The recipe is up on the blog. And then we will smoke some of them down to dried, and I've got my dried smoked chilies to put into treats and everything. Chilies, one of the reasons I smoke them is because they taste awesome, and I dry them to smoke that way. The other reason is that dehydrating them indoors can be painful. All of that capsicum that's in the chilies that makes your eyes water and makes your hands burn if you touch them and things like that. If you start to dehydrate them in your house, that's going to come up into the air, and you can get some pretty burny eyeballs. And it can also flavor your dehydrator. So if you're going to dry them, I recommend doing them in a dehydrator, and I recommend putting that in a garage, outdoor, shed, somewhere where you're not going to regret it for the next few days. Yes?
Did you say that you smoke them and then dry them, or you just dry them while you smoke them?
I dry them while I smoke them. So when we smoke them, we're doing real low heat on the grill with just a few briquettes and some wood chips. We'll use apple wood chips. Sometimes I'll dried apple peel that I'll throw on there for the flavor. And we'll smoke them there, real low temp. I'll smoke them down to a pretty pliable consistency if I'm going to use them for the chili paste. They'll be still pretty pliable. I think I've got a time here. So yeah, I'll do them. I'll run through a smoke cycle of about a dozen briquettes, what it takes to burn down a dozen briquettes, so a couple hours maybe. And we're constantly feeding that with chips to keep it smoking. That's still really, really soft. So these guys will go for like 12 hours or more, depending on the chili, to get them dry enough that they're safe to be shelf stable and stored. But these guys were dried in September, end of September, and they've got a little pliability in them, but they're definitely still dry and good to use and stuff like that. So.
What kind of chilies are those?
These ones are, what did I do this year? I did a mix. I had some jalapenos, I had some serranos. I did not do any bird's eye. I did those one year. That was a little potent. Thai chilies,
What
yes.
type of wood to smoke? What type of wood do you use? Chips?
I'm trying to remember. I think I used what I had on hand. I often have some sort of a fruit, an apple or a cherry, and maybe some alder. The main things that I smoke are the chilies and cheese, actually. So we like a little bit of the alder flavor on there. But again, you're smoking super low temperatures, and sometimes it's hard to even do. If you have a smoker, you got to see what your temperature settings will be in there. You may need a bonus box en route to keep things cool enough. Yeah. I have talked for almost an entire hour. We've got a few minutes left for questions, so let's run through them as we go. Yes?
So just to go back to the plums, and you mentioned that you were letting them dry out before putting them in the dehydrator. Did you cut them and then?
If I'm doing like a red plum or a yellow plum, I'll cut them into halves or quarters or whatever I'm going to do them in, and then I'll let them stick them on a tray and let them drain a little bit of juice. I usually catch the juice to use for something else.
A day, multiple days?
No, not that long, maybe like half an hour, just so they stop dripping.
Yeah.
If you've got really juicy ones, then they're going to release quite a bit of liquid. And it's the same with a lot of your fruits. If your fruit's overripe, sometimes it's better to use it as a fruit leather because you're going to take advantage of that puree and adhesion point. And underripe fruits
So
are almost
I'm
better.
interested in this
Yeah.
plastic, the food grade plastic that you cut.
Yeah.
Because I've used that kind of dehydrator and had just a flood of juice out of it.
Oh, yep, yeah, let them
That's
drain
more of a
first.
trick?
Yep, yeah, let them drain first. That has more to do with it than the plastic, for sure. And over here.
Yeah, I used to dry thyme,
Mm-hmm.
but I found it was really tedious to get the little leaves off.
After you dried it?
Yeah.
Yep, thyme I'll dry, and I don't mind if I'm doing the ends of it and it's got a little bit of leaf. I tend to take it off beforehand. I can run my fingers up that stem and I'll break off that top little portion of it and I'll just accept that amount of stem in it, but that's all the softer stem, but then it comes off that lower part. Yeah, try pulling it off first and then putting it onto something where it won't fall through. Anybody else? You good to roll? Yes.
On the oregano, you have copious amounts of it, so it doesn't matter how much you cut,
Yep.
when you cut it. But if you take and run your finger down the stem while it's still green and throw away your bud or put it in a vase or whatever, then you have no stems.
Yep.
And you can put it on a cloth and let it dry out that way.
Yep.
The other thing I wanted to mention was at school we use the Excelsiors. And when we do the fruit leathers, I have the kids run it into strips because it tends to dry a little bit faster.
Yep.
And I also have them put like just the teeniest little bit of oil and rub that on their sheets to make sure.
Yeah, that might be a good trick for your sheets, yep.
Otherwise the center gets a little puddled, it's not quite done.
Yep.
Everybody gets the same amount.
Yep, yeah, no, if you've got a square, or the dryer she's talking about has a rectangular dehydrator with square sheets, so you can totally do strips on there for your fruit leather. With my round one, I tend to just fill the whole tray. But again, since I'm filling it, I'm pretty consistent in how I fill each level. If you're working with a group of kids, which I do recommend drying their own fruit leather if you've got kids.
I put
Work with
pulpy
them.
fruit.
Yep.
in your berries.
Yep. So, yeah,
The pears.
thank you, yes. Well, thank you all very much for coming.